Victorian marriage was nothing like you imagine. The true story of Victorian marriage, property, coercion, and the long fight for legal personhood. You know the image, the white dress, the blushing bride, the church full of flowers, the doting husband waiting at the altar with tears in his eyes, overwhelmed by love and gratitude that this perfect woman has agreed to share his life. The wedding cake, the guests throwing rice, the couple riding away in a carriage toward a future of domestic bliss, mutual respect, and gentle Victorian happiness. It is one of the most persistent myths in all of Western history, and almost every single element of it is wrong. Victorian marriage, the marriage of the period from roughly 1837 to 1901, the 64-year reign of Queen Victoria herself, was one of the most brutal, economically coercive, legally exploitative, and sexually hypocritical institutions in the history of the English-speaking world. It was an institution in which a woman, upon marriage, legally ceased to exist as an independent person. Her property became her husband's. Her body became her husband's. Her children became her husband's. Her wages, if she worked, became her husband's. If she left him, she lost everything, including the children she had carried and birthed. If he beat her, the law shrugged. If he spent every penny she owned, the law smiled and called it his right. The white dress, by the way, was Queen Victoria's personal fashion choice in 1840 and didn't become a universal standard until decades later. Before Victoria wore white, brides wore whatever color they could afford or already owned. Red was common. Blue was considered lucky. Black was perfectly acceptable. The entire industry of white wedding dresses is a marketing invention built on one woman's sartorial preference. But the white dress is a perfect metaphor for the myth of Victorian marriage, a single image, stripped of all its messy context, laundered into something pure and timeless that was never actually true. Victorian marriage was not a love story. It was a property transaction, a legal merger, a social contract, and a life sentence, sometimes a very short one, given the maternal mortality rates, that trapped millions of people in arrangements they had little power to escape and even less power to negotiate. And the Victorians knew this. The most perceptive among them said so, clearly and loudly and in print, and were largely ignored, because the myth was too useful, too profitable, and too central to the social order that the people with power wanted to maintain. This is the true story of Victorian marriage. It is not romantic, but it is real. Let us begin with the fundamental economic reality of Victorian marriage, because without it, nothing else makes sense. In the Victorian period, a middle-class or upper-class woman had essentially one legal and socially sanctioned means of economic survival: marriage. She could not own property independently if she was married. She could not sign contracts. She could not conduct business in her own name. She could not vote. She could not attend university. Oxford and Cambridge didn't grant women full degrees until 1920 and 1948, respectively. In most professional fields, her employment was simply not available. No law firm would retain a woman, and no hospital would credential a female physician, no bank would employ a female manager. A woman of the middle and upper classes who did not marry faced a specific social fate. She became a dependent, living on the charity of male relatives, performing unpaid domestic labor in exchange for room and board, declining in social status with every passing year of her spinsterhood, subject to the pity and barely disguised contempt of everyone around her. Marriage was not, for a Victorian woman, a romantic choice. It was a financial necessity with romantic decoration applied afterward. The marriage market operated with remarkable transparency by modern standards. Parents of marriageable daughters and parents of marriageable sons assessed each other's financial and social positions with a directness that the modern world, only with its pretense that love is the only relevant consideration, finds startling. The season, the London social season that ran from roughly May to July each year, was explicitly and unembarrassedly a marriage market. Young women from good families were presented at court, the formal introduction to society called the coming out, then escorted to an exhausting round of balls, garden parties, dinners, and other social events whose primary purpose was to display the available merchandise to potential buyers, and to allow those potential buyers to display themselves in return. The calculations that families made were financial as much as social. A man with a good income but no title might be passed over for a man with a title but modest income, depending on the specific priorities of a specific family. A woman with a substantial dowry had significantly more choice than a woman with a pretty face and no money. The terms of marriage settlements, the legal documents that specified what property each party brought to the marriage and how it would be managed, were negotiated by solicitors on both sides before any wedding invitations were issued. The novelist Anthony Trollope, whose acute observations of Victorian social life remain among the most reliable guides to the period's actual values, described the process with dry precision. There is no road to wealth so easy and respectable as that of matrimony. He was not being cynical, he was being accurate. The legal framework governing Victorian marriage was called coverture, a doctrine inherited from medieval common law that held that upon marriage, a woman's legal identity was subsumed entirely into her husband's. The word comes from the Norman French coverture, meaning cover or covering. A married woman was femme couverte, a covered woman, legally invisible beneath the identity of her husband. She could not sue or be sued in her own name. She could not enter into contracts. She could not make a will without her husband's permission. She could not keep her own earnings. If she owned property before marriage, a house, investments, jewelry, it passed entirely to her husband upon marriage, without her consent and without any legal mechanism for reclaiming it. This was not a matter of some women being unfortunate enough to marry controlling men. This was the law, applying equally to every married woman in England, regardless of the specific character of her husband. The Married Women's Property Act of 1870, one of the most important pieces of legislation in Victorian history, began, slowly and incompletely, to unravel this system. It allowed married women to keep their own earnings and to inherit money without it automatically transferring to their husbands. But notice the date, 1870, 33 years into Victoria's reign. Millions of women were married, widowed, and died under the full weight of the coverture system before Parliament could be persuaded to modify it. And even the 1870 Act was only a partial reform. The more comprehensive Married Women's Property Act of 1882 gave women the right to own property in their own names during marriage, but by then the reign was already in its final 2 decades. The law that governed most of the Victorian period treated married women as economic non-persons. This was not an oversight or an inadvertent consequence of other policies. It was the intended design of a system built specifically to ensure that the transfer of wealth between families, which is what marriage, at its legal core, actually was, occurred on terms that privileged the male line of inheritance and the economic interests of husbands over those of wives. What did this mean in practice? It meant that a woman could marry a man who seemed financially sound, and if his fortune subsequently failed, through bad investments, gambling, professional failure, or simple extravagance, she had no legal protection. Her own property, her own inheritance, her own savings were all his to dispose of as he chose. He could spend every penny she brought to the marriage and leave her in poverty, and the law would protect his right to do so. This happened constantly. Victorian literature is full of examples because Victorian life was full of them. The plot of dozens of major Victorian novels, from Middlemarch to The Portrait of a Lady to Vanity Fair, turns on the financial catastrophe that follows a woman's miscalculation of her husband's economic character or fortune. George Eliot, who had extensive personal experience of the legal and financial vulnerabilities of women, having lived outside the conventions of Victorian marriage herself, described the situation with shattering precision in Middlemarch. Dorothea Brooke's financial independence evaporates upon her marriage to Casaubon, not because of any special cruelty on his part, but simply because the law gave him her assets as automatically as it gave him her name. For working-class women, the economic logic of marriage was different in its specific calculations, but identical in its fundamental coercive structure. A working-class woman's wages were not sufficient to support independent life. The wages available to women, domestic service, textile work, laundry, seamstressing, were specifically set below the level required for independent subsistence, on the logic that women would be supported by husbands and were therefore only supplementing a family income rather than earning a living wage. This was, of course, a self-fulfilling economic arrangement. Women were kept dependent on marriage by being paid wages insufficient for independence, and then treated as naturally dependent because they were, in fact, dependent. The working-class woman who married got, if she was lucky, a husband whose wages could support a household, barely. She got the legal right to his surname and the social protection of the Mrs. that conferred respectability. She got the children that would come almost annually for the first decade of a fertile marriage, each one a new financial burden and a new physical risk. She got the labor of household management, which for a Victorian working-class woman meant cooking, cleaning, mending, managing money that was never quite enough, and stretching resources in ways that required constant ingenuity and relentless effort. In return, she gave him the legal right to her body, her domestic labor, her earnings if she worked outside the home, and the children she bore. The exchange was not hidden. The Victorians understood it perfectly well. The specific mechanism by which the Victorian marriage market operated at the level of the season deserves closer examination, because it reveals the extent to which the romantic presentation of Victorian courtship was a performance layered over a commercial transaction. The season cost money, substantial money that only the upper and upper middle classes could afford. The rental of a London house for the season, the equipment of a daughter with an appropriate wardrobe, the subscriptions to the right assemblies and the right sporting events, the entertainment costs of receiving and returning calls, all of this could amount to thousands of pounds for a single season. Families of more modest means attempted the season at considerable financial strain, because the investment in a successful marriage for a daughter could recoup the expense many times over, and the failure to secure any prospect at all after 2 or 3 seasons was a social and financial catastrophe. The desperation that attended the failure of a girl's season was real and documented. The phrase "on the shelf" applied to a young woman who had failed to attract a proposal within her expected marriage window carried genuine social and economic weight. Off the shelf meant poverty, dependency, and the slow narrowing of options that attended the Victorian spinster's life. The dowry system, the transfer of property or money from the bride's family to the groom or to the new household upon marriage, was a central mechanism of Victorian marriage economics that the Romantic mythology tends to minimize. In upper-class Victorian marriages, the marriage settlement was a complex legal document specifying in detail what property each party brought, how that property would be managed during the marriage, what provision would be made for the wife in the event of her husband's death, and what would happen to any property entailed to specific heirs. These settlements were negotiated by solicitors on both sides, sometimes over periods of weeks or months, before any public announcement of the engagement. The emotional relationship between the couple was, in this negotiation, essentially irrelevant. The financial terms were what mattered. A settlement that did not adequately protect the wife's interests was a failure of the bride's family to negotiate competently. The fact that the woman whose future was being determined was typically not present at these negotiations, and had no legal standing in them in any case, was simply how the Victorian marriage market worked. Victorian courtship was not romantic. It was a highly regulated performance conducted under conditions of intense surveillance, with enormous social stakes attached to every gesture, every conversation, and every perceived deviation from the prescribed script. Young women of the middle and upper classes were not permitted to be alone with an unmarried man who was not a close family member, not alone in a room, not alone on a walk, not alone in a carriage, not alone in a garden. And the requirement for a chaperone, a married or older woman whose presence guaranteed that nothing improper could occur, was not a suggestion or a social preference. It was an absolute rule whose violation carried consequences that could be professionally and socially catastrophic. The logic of this surveillance system was explicitly economic, even when it was framed in the language of morality and female virtue. A woman's marriage prospects depended on her reputation for propriety. Her reputation for propriety depended on the absence of any opportunity for impropriety. Therefore, she must never be in a situation where impropriety was possible, not because she would necessarily be improper, but because the mere possibility of impropriety would attach itself to her reputation like a stain that nothing could remove. The chaperone system meant that Victorian courtship occurred in a specific set of highly structured settings, all designed to allow social interaction while preventing genuine intimacy. The ball was the primary courtship venue for the upper and middle classes. It was a carefully choreographed event in which young men asked young women to dance, with the prior approval of the chaperone, and with a dance card system that prevented any individual couple from spending too much of the evening together. A woman who danced more than 2 dances with the same man in an evening was understood to be signaling serious interest, and the man who solicited a 3rd dance without honorable intentions was considered a cad. The afternoon call was another courtship venue. A formalized visit to the home of a family with a marriageable daughter are conducted in the formal parlor under the watchful eye of at least one family member, limited to a specific duration, traditionally 15 minutes to half an hour, and governed by precise rules about what subjects could be discussed, how questions could be asked, and how interest could be signaled without crossing the line between appropriate and forward. The walk in a public park was a sanctioned form of interaction, but only in a public park, never in a private garden, and always in view of others. The public concert, the museum visit, the dinner party, where the seating plan was arranged to facilitate specific conversations between specific people, all of these venues shared a characteristic. They allowed men to assess women as potential partners while minimizing any possibility of the woman exercising genuine independent judgment about the man. She could observe his manners. She could hear his conversation, such as it was, constrained by propriety. She could assess his social ease. She could not ask him about his finances, his professional prospects, his personal history, his character in less formal settings, or his private behavior. The proposal itself was as scripted as everything that preceded it. A man who intended to propose to a woman was expected first to approach her father, or, if her father was dead, her nearest male guardian, to seek permission to address her. This permission was, ostensibly, merely a formality, the guardian simply confirming that he had no objection to the suit. In practice, it was an economic negotiation conducted in the language of social propriety. The father who received a suitor's approach would inquire about the man's income, his prospects, and his family position. A man whose finances were inadequate would be politely declined at this stage, saving everyone the awkwardness of a formal refusal from the daughter herself. Only when the guardian's approval was secured, financially and socially, would the man be permitted to speak to the woman directly. This meant, of course, that a woman's first indication that a specific man was seriously interested in her might be a formal marriage proposal delivered after her father had already approved the match. She was being asked not to choose, but to ratify a choice that had already been made on her behalf. The pressure on women to accept was immense, and the social costs of refusal were real. A woman who refused too many proposals acquired a reputation for being difficult, or for having unrealistic expectations, or for being unfeminine in her unwillingness to subordinate her preferences to the suitable matches that Providence and society were providing for her. The woman who turned down multiple suitors was a comic figure in Victorian literature, the unmarried blue-stocking, the spinster who had been too clever or too particular, the woman who was getting older and would soon have no choices left at all. Meanwhile, the woman who accepted too quickly, or who showed too much enthusiasm for a particular man before the formal proposal stage, was considered forward, a word that in Victorian usage conveyed something between impropriety and social aggression. The correct performance of female behavior in the courtship process required a woman to appear simultaneously interested enough to encourage the right suitor and disinterested enough to preserve her reputation for propriety. It was a razor's edge walked on stilts. The information asymmetry in Victorian courtship was staggering. A man approaching a woman in the marriage market had access to considerable information about her family, her fortune, and her general reputation from the social network within which the courtship occurred. He could ask questions of her family's acquaintances. He could inquire of his solicitor about the status of her father's estate. He could learn, through the elaborate intelligence networks of Victorian social life, whether she was likely to be well dowried, whether her family was in financial difficulty, whether she had any history of behavior that reflected negatively on her family's name. The woman, by contrast, had almost no reliable access to equivalent information about the man. She could observe his social behavior, which was performed specifically for her assessment and therefore unreliable as a guide to his actual character. She had no access to his financial records. She could not ask directly about his income without being considered vulgar. She could not inquire of his previous intimate relationships, which often included histories that would have been highly relevant to her decision, but which the standards of male respectability actively concealed. The result was that women entered marriage with far less information about their prospective husbands than those husbands possessed about their prospective wives, and with far more at stake in the outcome. The great Victorian marriage advice literature, the torrents of books, pamphlets, magazine articles, and household manuals that addressed the subject of how to court, how to propose, and how to choose a partner, was, for all its apparent variety, remarkably uniform in its fundamental message to women. The message was, be passive, be patient, be sweet-tempered and cheerful, and morally unimpeachable. Make yourself attractive to the right kind of man by exhibiting the domestic virtues that the right kind of man valued. Do not be too clever, or at least do not advertise your cleverness, because men found intellectual women threatening. Do not have opinions that were too strongly held. Do not laugh too loudly. Do not express too much ambition. Above all, do not appear to want marriage too desperately. even though your entire future depended on securing it. This was the advice that the Victorian establishment gave to women about one of the most consequential decisions of their lives. Not, find out as much as possible about the person you are considering. Not, ensure that you have compatible values and realistic expectations. But, be quiet, be good, be pretty, and wait. The courtship advice given to men was essentially the opposite. Men were counseled to be decisive, to pursue their suit vigorously, to present themselves confidently, and to win over both the family and the woman with appropriate displays of masculine competence and social standing. There was also, running beneath the surface of the respectable courtship advice literature, an extensive parallel literature of advice about how to manage women, how to present a favorable impression without committing to more than one intended, how to test a woman's temperament before proposing, how to assess whether a potential wife would make a good household manager. Samuel Smiles, the great Victorian prophet of self-improvement, explicitly advised young men to assess a potential wife's domestic management of her parents' household before proposing, watching for evidence of tidiness, frugality, and efficient housekeeping as indicators of her fitness for the role she was being recruited for. The woman was being assessed. The man was doing the assessing. The power differential was not incidental to Victorian courtship. It was its fundamental structure. The role of the Victorian novel in shaping, and sometimes subtly subverting, the cultural expectations of courtship deserves specific attention because the novel was the dominant popular cultural form of the period, and its influence on how Victorians understood their own social world was profound. The Victorians read novels voraciously, and those novels both reflected and reinforced the ideological assumptions of Victorian courtship. Jane Austen's novels, technically pre-Victorian, but widely read and deeply influential throughout the period, presented courtship as a process in which intelligent women could exercise meaningful judgment about their prospective partners, and in which the assessment of a man's character and values was a legitimate female activity. This was more radical than it sounds in the context of the actual Victorian courtship market, where women's opportunities for genuine character assessment were so constrained. Austen's heroines were readers of men, not merely reflections of male desire. And this reading, this exercise of female intelligence in the service of female self-protection, was one of the most important cultural gifts the novels provided to the young women who read them. The engagement period, once a formal proposal had been accepted, was its own highly specific social environment with its own rules and pressures. An engaged couple was permitted somewhat more freedom of interaction than a merely courting one. They could correspond directly. They could take walks together with only minimal chaperonage. They could develop the kind of acquaintance that the earlier stages of courtship had not permitted. But the engagement also created specific pressures, particularly for the woman. Breaking an engagement was socially difficult, and the consequences fell more heavily on the woman who broke it than on the man. A woman who broke an engagement without compelling cause risked the reputation of being fickle or difficult. A woman whose engagement was broken by the man could, and frequently did, sue for breach of promise, with the associated public exposure of her situation. The engagement was, in this sense, not a free space for the couple to discover their mutual suitability, but another stage of the commercial process in which premature withdrawal carried significant penalties. The specific experience of courtship for Victorian women of different religious backgrounds reveals how the chaperonage system and the marriage market operated with significant variation beneath the apparent uniformity of Victorian middle-class culture. Jewish middle-class families in Victorian England, for instance, maintained their own networks of matrimonial introduction. The shadchan, or matchmaker, continued to function as an institution within Anglo-Jewish communities, even as those communities aspired to and partially achieved integration into the broader Victorian social world. Catholic families, particularly those of Irish immigrant backgrounds, operated within their own parish-based networks that provided a somewhat different set of courtship opportunities and constraints from those of the Protestant establishment. Nonconformist families, Quakers, Methodists, Congregationalists, had their own chapel-centered social worlds that both enforced and slightly modified the mainstream courtship conventions. These variations are important because they remind us that Victorian marriage was not a single unified practice, but a dominant ideology under which a considerable variety of actual practices occurred, many of them shaped by religious, ethnic, class, and regional specificity. The role of the post office in Victorian courtship, specifically the expansion of the cheap penny post from 1840 onward, created a new dimension of courtship that the chaperonage system had not anticipated and could not fully control. A Victorian couple who had met in supervised social settings could, through letters, develop a private correspondence that was, by definition, unsupervised. Letters passed between a courting couple were not chaperone-approved. They could not be monitored in the same way that a drawing-room conversation could be. The Victorian love letter, the genre that produced some of the period's most extraordinary private writing, including the letters of Robert Browning and Elizabeth Barrett that were eventually published, was a space of genuine intimacy and genuine expression that the social machinery of Victorian courtship otherwise prevented. The irony of the penny post as a feminist tool is exquisite. Rowland Hill's postal reform, introduced for economic and administrative reasons entirely unrelated to women's freedom, created a private communicative channel that allowed Victorian women and men to know each other more genuinely than the supervised drawing-room encounter ever permitted. Here is something that Victorian conduct manuals, respectable society, and the entire apparatus of middle-class female education conspired to ensure a significant proportion of Victorian brides went to their wedding nights in a state of profound ignorance about what was about to happen to them. This is not hyperbole. It is documented by the women themselves in letters and diaries that have survived, and by the physicians who subsequently treated the consequences. The ideology of female purity that governed Victorian middle-class culture required that a good woman be innocent of sexual knowledge. Innocence was not merely valued, it was definitional. A woman who possessed detailed knowledge of sexual matters was, by that very fact, suspected of having acquired it through experience rather than through information, which meant she was not the kind of woman a respectable man married. The social logic was airtight and utterly catastrophic in its practical consequences. Mothers did not tell their daughters what to expect, or rather, the most that most Victorian mothers provided was a vague and anxiety-producing reference to duties and what marriage entails, formulations so coded and euphemistic as to be effectively meaningless to a young woman with no frame of reference for decoding them. The medical literature of the period is full of accounts from Victorian physicians, almost all of them male, working in a profession that had complex attitudes toward female sexuality, of brides presenting with what would today be recognized as the psychological and physical consequences of unexpected and traumatic sexual initiation. The physician, William Acton, whose 1857 work, The Functions and Disorders of the Reproductive Organs, was one of the most widely read medical texts of the period, is notorious for the claim that the majority of women, happily for them, are not very much troubled with sexual feeling of any kind. This statement, which was almost certainly false even when he wrote it, was accepted as received wisdom by large portions of the Victorian medical establishment, because it served the ideological function of justifying the system that denied women sexual agency. The consequences of this systematic ignorance were serious and well documented. The physician Elizabeth Blackwell, the first woman to gain a medical degree in the United States and one of the most important figures in Victorian women's medicine, specifically challenged Acton's claims. Drawing on her clinical experience with female patients, Blackwell argued that women did in fact have sexual feelings, that the denial of this was both medically false and practically harmful, and that the system of female ignorance that Victorian society maintained was causing real physical and psychological damage to real women. Her arguments were largely ignored or patronized by the male medical establishment. Acton's fantasy of the asexual wife was simply more convenient. What the historical record actually shows, through letters, diaries, and the fragmentary clinical records of the period, is that Victorian women's sexual experiences varied enormously. Some women clearly did experience satisfying intimate lives with their husbands, but a very large number of them experienced the sexual dimension of marriage as an ordeal, something to be endured rather than enjoyed, something to be scheduled and managed and minimized rather than engaged with as a source of pleasure. The absolute legal right of a husband to marital sexual relations, regardless of his wife's willingness or physical condition, was not challenged in English law until 1991. When the House of Lords finally ruled that marital rape was a criminal offense. Pause and absorb that date. 1991. The legal framework that protected a Victorian husband's right to his wife's body, regardless of her consent, survived essentially intact for almost a century after the end of the Victorian era. Throughout the entire Victorian period, it was legally and socially accepted that a wife's duty included the provision of sexual relations on demand, and that refusal was a breach of the marriage contract with legal consequences. This is not a fringe or extreme position. This was mainstream Victorian law, explicitly stated in the legal texts, never seriously challenged in the courts, accepted as a natural consequence of the coverture doctrine that made a wife's body the legal property of her husband. The management of Victorian wives' sexual availability also intersected with the Victorian era's most pressing practical problem, the management of fertility. Victorian contraception existed, but it was not widely discussed in polite society, not taught to young women, not available in any standardized form, and not reliably effective with the technologies that were available. There, the consequence was that a Victorian woman who was sexually active, as every married woman was legally required to be, could expect to become pregnant repeatedly throughout her fertile years. The statistics are brutal. A woman who married at 20 and remained married for 20 years might expect to become pregnant 8 to 12 times. Of those pregnancies, perhaps 6 to 10 would result in live births. Of those live births, depending heavily on class and the specific decade within the Victorian period, somewhere between 1 and 4 children might die before the age of 5. Maternal mortality was not a rare catastrophe. It was a constant presence. Between 1 and 2% of all childbirths in the Victorian period resulted in the death of the mother, from hemorrhage, from puerperal fever, from eclampsia, and from the multitude of obstetric complications that could not be managed by the limited medical knowledge available. A woman who experienced 12 pregnancies had a cumulative lifetime risk of dying in childbirth that was genuinely significant by any measure. Queen Victoria herself, whose name defines the era and who is often treated as the apotheosis of Victorian domestic virtue, was famously explicit about her feelings regarding pregnancy and childbirth, in a way that the mythology of Victorian womanhood tends to suppress. Victoria's letters and journals are full of references to the shadow side of marriage, to pregnancy as a state she found humiliating and uncomfortable, to childbirth as an ordeal she faced 9 times with a mixture of courage and something very close to dread. Her letter to her eldest daughter, Vicky, in 1858, written after Vicky's first pregnancy, includes one of the most frank statements of the physical reality of Victorian married life ever written by a Victorian woman. What you say of the pride of giving life to an immortal soul is very fine, dear, but I own I cannot enter into that. I think much more of our being like a cow or a dog at such moments, when our poor nature becomes so very animal and undignified. This was the Queen, the woman whose domestic life was presented to the Victorian public as the ideal to which all British women should aspire, and her private assessment of the physical reality of that domestic life was that it was, at its most essential moments, degrading. The honeymoon, a Victorian innovation that became widespread from the mid-19th century, was supposed to be the romantic beginning of the married life. In practice, it often functioned as the setting for the sudden and disorienting revelation, for many brides, of what marriage actually required. Honeymoons were specifically private, the couple removed from the social scrutiny that governed their courtship, alone together for the first time, in an unfamiliar place, with the full weight of their new legal relationship determining the terms of their privacy. For a woman who had been told nothing, or close to nothing, about what to expect, and who had been explicitly instructed that she was to be accommodating and willing and uncomplaining, the honeymoon was often a deeply distressing experience. The letters that survive from Victorian honeymoons are mixed, and it would be false to claim that they are uniformly miserable, but the number that contain, beneath the obligatory expressions of happiness and social performance, something more complicated, anxiety, confusion, physical discomfort barely mentioned and then quickly changed to other subjects, is striking. The novelist Mary Wollstonecraft, Shelley's mother, Mary Wollstonecraft, wrote in the 18th century that the situation of women in marriage was that of a slave in a gilded cage. By the Victorian period, the cage had been considerably gilded. The middle-class married woman had far more material comfort than any of her working-class contemporaries. The bars were just as solid. The relationship between Victorian marriage and the specific medical history of the period is one of the most revealing dimensions of the institution, because medicine, presented as objective science, was in practice one of the primary mechanisms by which the ideology of female subordination was maintained and legitimized. The Victorian medical establishment largely endorsed, and in many cases actively constructed, the ideological framework that confined women to the domestic sphere and limited their aspirations to marriage and maternity. The argument took several forms, but they all converged on the same conclusion, that the female body was constitutionally unsuited for intellectual exertion, professional activity, or any sustained exercise of the capacities that public life required, and that the attempt to exercise those capacities would produce physical damage, specifically to the female reproductive system. Henry Maudsley, one of the most prominent Victorian psychiatrists, published in 1874 an essay arguing with apparent scientific authority that the education of women at the same level as men would result in the depletion of the vital nervous energy that women needed for menstruation and reproduction. His argument was, from a modern perspective, completely without scientific basis, but it was stated with the authority of a professional medical man and accepted by large portions of the Victorian-educated public because it told them what they wanted to believe, that the system they had built was justified by nature and by science, rather than by the interests of the men who had built it. The Victorian period's management of childbirth was, even by the standards of an era of limited medical knowledge, extraordinarily poor. And the reasons for this poverty reveal the ideological priorities of the system. The discovery that doctors who moved from performing autopsies to delivering babies without washing their hands were causing the epidemic rates of puerperal fever that killed 1 to 2% of women giving birth was made by Ignaz Semmelweis in 1847. The medical establishment's response to Semmelweis was not gratitude or rapid adoption of his recommendations. It was hostility, denial, and professional persecution. Semmelweis spent the last years of his life in a mental institution, his career destroyed by his colleagues' refusal to accept that their own unwashed hands were killing their patients. The adoption of antiseptic obstetric practice in Britain was slow and incomplete throughout the Victorian period, which means that tens of thousands of women died of preventable infections in Victorian maternity wards during the decades when the preventive measures were known but not consistently applied. The women who died of puerperal fever in Victorian hospitals were not victims of ignorance. They were victims of a professional culture that prized its own authority over its patients' lives. The mythology of Victorian marriage requires Victorian women to have been compliant, submissive, domestically devoted, and fundamentally satisfied with the arrangements that their society had constructed for them. The historical record says otherwise, and it says so with a persistence and a forcefulness that is impossible to explain as mere anomaly. Victorian women wrote letters, they kept diaries, they petitioned Parliament, they formed societies and associations and clubs, they wrote novels, an enormous number of novels, many of which are explicitly and precisely about the frustrations of women confined within the structures of Victorian marriage and domesticity. They wrote essays and treatises and polemical journalism. They organized politically in the teeth of ridicule and social censure around issues of women's legal status, women's education, and women's right to control their own lives. The idea that Victorian women were content with their situation is historically untenable. The evidence against it is overwhelming. What is true is that the content of their discontent was frequently suppressed, policed, or dismissed by the male-dominated social, political, and cultural apparatus of their era, which is not the same thing as the discontent not existing. The women who said so most clearly and most publicly in the Victorian period are among the most important intellectual figures of the era, and their arguments repay careful attention. John Stuart Mill's essay, The Subjection of Women, published in 1869, is one of the foundational texts of feminist political theory. But its specific argument about marriage is often underemphasized. Mill argued, with the full force of utilitarian logic and a detailed command of the relevant legal evidence, that the Victorian marriage institution was structurally indistinguishable from slavery. The wife, he pointed out, was bound to the husband by law in a way that even the most benevolent slave owner could not have replicated. She could not leave, could not own property, could not work in her own name, could not protect herself legally. She was entirely dependent on the moral character of a man she had chosen under conditions of near-complete ignorance, and whose character she could not change and could not escape. Mill was not the only man making these arguments, but his contribution was distinctive. He was making them as one of the most respected public intellectuals in England, and he was making them with the methodological precision of a trained philosopher, rather than the passionate advocacy of an activist. When Mill argued that Victorian marriage was a form of legal slavery, he was not making a rhetorical gesture. He was making a legal argument that he had carefully constructed and that he believed was rigorously correct. The women who wrote about their own experiences, often in the coded form of fiction that allowed them to say things that direct statement would not have permitted, were even more specific. Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre, published in 1847, is the most famous example, and it is a more radical text than its canonical status suggests. Jane Eyre's refusal of Rochester's first proposal, her insistence on moral equality, her rejection of the position of dependent beloved, her declaration that she was "no bird and no net ensnares me. I am a free human being with an independent will," was a direct challenge to the foundational assumptions of Victorian marriage ideology. The novel was celebrated, but its most radical elements were often smoothed over by readers who preferred to focus on the romance rather than the feminism. George Eliot's Middlemarch, published in 1871–72, is an even more thoroughgoing analysis of the mechanisms by which intelligent, ambitious women were trapped within the structures of Victorian marriage and domestic life. Dorothea Brooke, Eliot's protagonist, is explicitly presented as a woman of the highest capabilities, intellectual, moral, energetic, whose social context provides her with essentially no outlet for those capabilities except marriage, and whose marriage first constrains and then nearly destroys everything that makes her remarkable. The novel's final paragraph, one of the most elegiac in the English language, makes the political argument explicit. Dorothea's greatness is wasted not because she is inadequate, but because the medium in which their ardent deeds took shape is forever gone. The organized women's movement of the Victorian period, the movement that would eventually produce women's suffrage, was, in its early Victorian phases, primarily concerned not with the vote, but with the specific legal injustices of the marriage system. Barbara Lee Smith, Bodichon's 1854 pamphlet, A Brief Summary in Plain Language of the Most Important Laws Concerning Women, laid out the specifics of the coverture system with careful legal precision and distributed it to members of Parliament, journalists, and social reformers. It was one of the most effective pieces of political advocacy in Victorian history, contributing directly to the eventual passage of the Married Women's Property Acts. Bodichon's document is important because of what it is not. It is not an argument for dismantling marriage. It is not a radical challenge to the institution itself. It is a careful, legally precise, factual description of what the law actually did to women. And its implicit argument is that this specific legal situation was unjust, not that marriage as such was wrong. This distinction matters because it reveals the tactical intelligence of the Victorian feminist movement. The women who campaigned for legal reform knew that a frontal attack on the institution of marriage was politically impossible and socially counterproductive. What they could do, and what they did, and with considerable skill and patience, was document the specific legal mechanisms of injustice and argue for their reform on grounds that even conservatives could accept, that the law was causing measurable harm to identifiable people. What did Victorian women actually want from marriage when they were allowed to express this without social censure? The evidence, read carefully, suggests several consistent themes. First, they wanted the legal protections that men had. They wanted property rights. They wanted the ability to keep their own earnings. They wanted legal standing, the ability to sue, to sign contracts, to make wills, that the coverture system denied them. These are not radical demands. They are demands for basic legal personhood. Second, they wanted education. The expansion of women's access to formal education was one of the most contested social battles of the Victorian period, and the passion with which Victorian women pursued educational opportunities, through the foundation of Girton and Newnham colleges at Cambridge, through the expansion of girls' secondary education, through the long fight for access to the medical and legal professions, was a clear statement about the insufficiency of the domestic role as the sole outlet for female intelligence and ambition. Third, they wanted choice. Not necessarily the rejection of marriage, but the ability to choose it freely rather than be coerced into it by the absence of any alternative. A woman who married because she had no other means of economic survival was not, in any meaningful sense, choosing marriage, and she was accepting the only terms available to her. Victorian women understood this distinction perfectly well, even when they lacked the philosophical vocabulary to articulate it in the terms that later feminist theorists would develop. There is a particularly illuminating body of evidence in the matrimonial advertisements that appeared in Victorian newspapers from the 1860s onward. These advertisements, which were considered somewhat déclassé, but were widely used, particularly among the middle and lower middle classes who lacked access to the formal season, show Victorian men and women describing themselves and their requirements for a partner with a directness that the formal courtship process never permitted. Women's advertisements are particularly revealing. They consistently emphasize their own capabilities, their own financial situation, and their own specific requirements in ways that directly contradict the passive, preference-free image of the ideal Victorian woman. A typical advertisement might describe the advertiser as a woman of moderate means, pleasant appearance, and strong domestic skills, who required a partner with a steady income and a reasonable temperament, who would treat her with consideration and allow her some independence in the management of household matters. The phrase, "some independence in the management of household matters," is doing enormous work in the context of the coverture system. What it means, translated from the careful language of Victorian propriety, is, I want a husband who will not treat me as a slave. I want to be consulted. I want to exercise some agency in the domain that is officially my responsibility. I want to be a person in my marriage, not merely a possession. These are not revolutionary demands, but in the legal and social context of Victorian marriage, they were not guaranteed by any law or social convention. They were requests. They were things that a Victorian woman had to specifically ask for in a newspaper advertisement because the default legal arrangement gave her none of them. The suffrage movement, which grew from the Victorian feminist networks that had been building since the 1840s, was in its Victorian phase primarily a middle-class movement. And this class limitation is important for understanding both its achievements and its failures. The women who organized, petitioned, lectured, and campaigned for women's legal rights in the Victorian period were predominantly women who had the leisure, the education, the social connections, and the financial security, often provided by supportive husbands or family members, to engage in public political activity. Working-class women, whose relationship to Victorian marriage was more economically desperate and whose experience of its injustices was more immediately physical and material, were largely absent from the formal reform organizations, though not from the broader social movements that addressed working-class conditions. The class limitation of the Victorian feminist movement had consequences that persisted into the 20th century. The specific legal reforms that the Victorian feminists achieved, the Married Women's Property Acts, the Infant Custody Acts, primarily benefited middle-class women with property to protect and children whose custody was legally contested. The specific injustices faced by working-class women, low wages, sexual exploitation by employers, the inadequacy of poor law provision for deserted or widowed women with children, were addressed more slowly and more incompletely. Florence Nightingale, whose fame rests on her nursing reform work during and after the Crimean War, was also one of the most powerful and least acknowledged analysts of the Victorian marriage system. Her private note, Cassandra, written in 1852 and not published until 1928, is one of the most intensely personal and intellectually devastating critiques of Victorian domestic life ever written by someone who had direct experience of it. Nightingale describes, "From the inside, the experience of a woman of exceptional intelligence and ambition who was trapped in a social arrangement that had no use for her capabilities and that actively prevented her from developing them." The note reads, in the fragmentary, passionate, unparagraphed way of a text that was never intended for public consumption, as a cry of genuine anguish. Why cannot I be satisfied with the life that satisfies so many people? I am told that the lot of women is to be happy at home. What is it that makes me feel that I cannot be happy at home? What is the matter with me? Nightingale knew what was the matter. She was 32 years old when she wrote this, still trapped in her family's domestic arrangements, still waiting for the opportunity that would not come for another 2 years. She was describing, with precision and anguish, what it felt like to be a person of exceptional capacity, confined by an institution that had no use for exceptional capacity in women. The Victorian period produced a remarkable number of women who achieved distinction in fields that the ideology of Victorian wifely domesticity said were unavailable to them. And the relationship of these women to the marriage institution varied widely, revealing the range of choices and compromises that Victorian women actually made. Elizabeth Barrett Browning, the most celebrated female poet of the period, eloped with Robert Browning at the age of 40, escaping both an invalidism that was partly organic and partly social, and the control of a father who refused to permit any of his children to marry. Her marriage was, by all available evidence, a genuinely happy and genuinely equal. Two poets supporting each other's work, living on their combined incomes in Italy, treating each other as intellectual and emotional partners in ways that the Victorian English social world would not have permitted. Mary Ann Evans, the novelist who published as George Eliot, lived with the philosopher G.H. Lewis for over 20 years in a relationship they both considered a marriage in all but legal form, the legal form being unavailable because Lewis could not divorce his legally married wife. After Lewis's death, Eliot married John Cross, 20 years her junior, in a legal ceremony that shocked many of her admirers. Her various departures from Victorian convention were not random or unreflective. They were the considered choices of a woman who thought more carefully about the institution of marriage, its purposes and its failures, than almost anyone else in her era. Before 1857, divorce in England required a private act of Parliament. Let that sink in. To end a marriage, you needed Parliament to pass a law specifically about your marriage. The process required hiring solicitors, barristers, and parliamentary agents, presenting evidence to multiple legal bodies, securing the support of members of Parliament, and surviving a public examination of the most intimate details of your marriage that was essentially guaranteed to destroy your social reputation regardless of the outcome. Between 1670 and 1857, there were approximately 330 parliamentary divorces granted in England, in a population that grew from roughly 5 million to 20 million over that period, and in which a substantial proportion of those marriages were deeply and genuinely miserable. 330 divorces in nearly 2 centuries represents a divorce rate so vanishingly small as to be effectively non-existent. This was not because Victorian and pre-Victorian marriages were uniformly happy. It was because divorce was financially and practically impossible for almost everyone. The Matrimonial Causes Act of 1857 established the first secular divorce court in England and made divorce available through ordinary court proceedings rather than requiring a special act of Parliament. This was a genuine reform, and it was bitterly contested. And defenders of the old system argued, without any apparent irony, that making divorce easier would undermine the sanctity of marriage and threaten the foundations of society. But the 1857 Act contained a provision that revealed, with crystalline clarity, the fundamental assumptions about gender that governed the entire institution. The Act allowed a husband to divorce his wife for adultery alone, A wife, however, could only divorce her husband for adultery combined with at least one additional offense: cruelty, desertion, incest, rape, sodomy, or bestiality. The reasoning behind this asymmetry was explicitly stated in the parliamentary debates. A wife's adultery was an offense against her husband's property rights, the question of the paternity of children, and the legitimate inheritance of property. A husband's adultery, by contrast, was merely a moral failing, unfortunate, perhaps, but not legally equivalent to the wife's adultery because it did not threaten the husband's property interests in the same way. Property. The entire legal framework of Victorian marriage, including its rules about when it could be dissolved, was built on the premise that the wife was property. The costs of divorce, under the 1857 Act, even in its reformed version, remained prohibitive for the working class and lower middle class. A contested divorce case required legal representation at every stage, the fees for which could easily consume an annual working-class income. The court proceedings were public and extensively reported in the press, which meant that anyone who sought a divorce was guaranteed to have the most intimate and humiliating details of their married life printed in the newspapers for public consumption. Social ruin was the typical consequence of divorce, regardless of which party had caused the marriage to fail. For women, the consequences were particularly severe. A divorced woman, even a woman who had been divorced because of her husband's cruelty, adultery, or abuse, was socially disgraced. She could not remarry in church. She could not be received in polite society. She lost custody of her children in most cases because the law presumed paternal custody. She had no right to a share of the marital property she had helped create because the coverture doctrine had made it all his in the first place. If she worked for wages, those wages had been legally his throughout the marriage, so there was no savings, no financial buffer. The custody question was perhaps the most devastating consequence of Victorian divorce for women. Under Victorian law, children were the legal property of their fathers. A woman who left an abusive husband, or who was thrown out of the home, had no legal right to take her children with her. The father could retain the children, could prevent the mother from seeing them, could raise them in whatever way he chose, and the law backed him completely. Caroline Norton's case is the most famous illustration of this principle. Norton was a prominent Victorian literary figure, a writer, poet, and social campaigner, who in 1836 left her abusive husband, George Norton, taking her 3 young sons with her. George Norton then exercised his legal right as their father to take the boys back and deny Caroline access to them entirely. She could not sue for custody. She could not legally compel him to allow her to see them. Her children were not hers. They were his. The irony of Caroline Norton's situation, and it is a bitter one, is that the legal mechanism that allowed her husband to take her children and deny her access was the same mechanism that prevented her from keeping her own literary earnings. Everything she wrote and published belonged legally to George Norton, because she was his wife. She was fighting a custody battle using legal strategies that were constrained at every turn by the fact that the legal system treated her as her husband's possession. Caroline Norton's response to this situation was to do what Victorian women of intelligence and determination did when confronted with an unjust legal system. She documented it, publicized it, and lobbied Parliament to change it. Her 1836 pamphlet, The Natural Claim of a Mother to the Custody of Her Children, contributed directly to the passage of the Infant Custody Act of 1839. The first piece of Victorian legislation to give mothers any legal custody rights at all. The act was limited. It only applied to children under 7, and it gave courts the discretion to award access to the mother, not the right. But it was a beginning. It was also, in a specific and personal way, too late for Norton's own children. Her youngest son died following a riding accident in 1842 while in his father's custody, at an age when Caroline had had very limited legal access to him. The letter she wrote to George Norton after their son's death is one of the most anguished documents in Victorian history. "I would have died for him," she wrote, and then described the years of legal separation that had prevented her from being the mother she wanted to be. The alternative to formal divorce, for those who could not afford the legal costs or whose specific circumstances did not meet the legal criteria, was desertion, and desertion was common. Victorian newspapers were full of notices placed by husbands disavowing responsibility for their wives' debts, a legal formality required after a wife had left the household that makes little sense unless you understand that the husband was legally liable for debts contracted in his name by his wife. These notices are, in their dry legal language, a record of the number of Victorian marriages that simply fell apart without any formal legal dissolution. The man who deserted had the easier path. He could leave, establish himself elsewhere under his own name or a new one, live without legal consequence, because the law that held him responsible for his wife's debts while they lived together ceased to apply once he had publicly disavowed her. The practical tools of his own mobility, employment, property ownership, freedom of movement, remained available to him. The woman who was deserted had no such options. She was legally still married, which meant she could not remarry. She was often left with children and no income. The poor law system, the Victorian welfare state, provided minimal support, but its conditions were deliberately humiliating, intended to function as a deterrent to poverty rather than as genuine assistance. The workhouse, the final resort, was widely and accurately understood to be a place where families were broken up, where conditions were deliberately harsh, and where the experience was designed to imprint the lesson that poverty was a moral failure rather than a structural consequence. The experience of middle-class Victorian widows reveals, with particular clarity, the extent to which the protections that Victorian marriage was supposed to provide were contingent rather than guaranteed. A widow's legal position in the Victorian period was, paradoxically, in some respects stronger than her married sisters. As a feme sole rather than a feme covert, she had full legal personality and could own property, enter contracts, and conduct business in her own name. But the practical position of a Victorian widow depended entirely on what provision her husband had made for her before his death, and on the generosity or otherwise of the male relatives who formed the social and legal framework of Victorian upper-class family life. A husband who died intestate, without a will, left his widow dependent on the rules of intestate succession, which in the Victorian period were not uniformly favorable to wives. A husband who had made poor business decisions, or who had gambled, or who had simply spent more than he earned over a lifetime, could leave his widow with nothing but debts and the expectation of her own relatives' charity. The number of Victorian novels in which the death of a husband precipitates the economic catastrophe of his widow and dependent children is not a coincidence of literary taste. It is a record of an extremely common social reality. The Victorian period's treatment of married women's mental health is a specific chapter of institutional cruelty that recent scholarship has begun to recover in detail. The lunacy laws of the Victorian period allowed a husband to have his wife committed to an asylum without her consent on the basis of a certificate from 2 doctors with no recourse for the wife and no independent oversight of the decision. Women who resisted their husband's authority, who expressed unconventional opinions, who were sexually unavailable or demanded separation, or who were simply inconvenient to their husbands' lives, were committed to Victorian asylums in numbers that exceeded what could be accounted for by any realistic assessment of the prevalence of genuine mental illness. The case files of Victorian lunatic asylums include women whose diagnoses, documented in the medical notes, were effectively inconvenient wife. They were committed for moral insanity, which meant any significant deviation from expected social behavior, for hysteria, which meant in practice emotional disturbance of any kind, or for nymphomania, which in Victorian medical usage described any level of female sexual interest that exceeded the prescribed near zero. These women could not legally refuse their committal, could not legally challenge their detention, and in many cases spent years or decades in asylums as a direct consequence of exercising the kinds of agency and self-assertion that the same culture expected and rewarded in men. Victorian marriage was not a system that benefited men uniformly. It was a system designed to serve the interests of the propertied classes and the social order those classes had built. And if men of those classes who played by the rules tended to benefit more than women who played by the rules, it does not follow that men had no grievances or that the institution was not also, in its own ways, a trap for them. The specific trap that Victorian marriage set for men was different in its mechanisms from the trap it set for women, but it was a trap nonetheless, and understanding it matters for any honest account of what Victorian marriage actually was. For a Victorian middle-class man, marriage was not merely a romantic or domestic arrangement, it was a professional and social prerequisite. A bachelor, in Victorian professional culture, was viewed with suspicion. A man who had reached his 30s without marrying was assumed to have some character deficiency that had made him unmarriageable or some personal circumstance, poverty, illegitimacy, a history of scandal, that had made him an unsuitable catch. The professional world of Victorian England was structured around the assumption that men in senior positions were married men. They had the stability, the social connections, the domestic grounding that marriage was supposed to provide, and they had the visible stake in social order that a family represented. The clergyman who was not married was a figure of some awkwardness in his parish. The barrister who remained a bachelor into his 40s was regarded with raised eyebrows by his colleagues. The businessman who had not married by the time he sought credit or investment from the financial establishment was a less reliable prospect than one who had. The social requirement of marriage was enforced not by law, but by professional culture, which, for a Victorian professional man, was equally binding. The financial obligations that marriage imposed on Victorian men were enormous, and they were imposed by social convention as rigorously as any legal requirement. A Victorian middle-class man was expected to maintain a household at a standard appropriate to his professional status. This meant a house of appropriate size and location, renting or purchasing in the right area, furnishing to the right standard, maintaining the domestic establishment at a level that visibly declared his economic position. It meant employing servants, at minimum a cook and a parlor maid, and in more prosperous households a full domestic staff, because a household without servants was not a middle-class household. It meant supporting a wife who, by the middle-class conventions of the period, did not work outside the home, because a wife who worked was evidence that her husband could not provide adequately, which was a social humiliation. And it meant supporting the children who would come from the marriage at a level appropriate to the family's station, including the increasingly expensive requirement of educating sons at appropriate schools. These obligations were substantial, and they increased with every child and with every rise in professional status. The Victorian man who succeeded professionally also obligated himself to higher and higher levels of household expenditure to maintain the social standard that his success was supposed to demand. Many Victorian men were financially strangled by these obligations, working themselves to premature illness or death in the effort to maintain a household standard that had become insupportable. The emotional constraints of Victorian masculinity within marriage were equally severe and equally under-examined. The Victorian ideal of manly stoicism, the husband who provided without complaint, who maintained the appearance of cheerful competence regardless of the pressures he was under, who did not discuss his professional anxieties or financial worries with his wife because that would be to burden her unfairly or to display an unmanning vulnerability, was a prescription for emotional isolation within the marriage relationship. Victorian men were not supposed to need emotional support from their wives, they were supposed to provide it. The asymmetry was total. The wife was the dependent, the husband the provider. The wife expressed vulnerability, the husband absorbed it. A man who was struggling financially or professionally or emotionally was not culturally permitted to express that struggle in the domestic space that was explicitly his wife's domain. The consequences of this emotional isolation are documented in the Victorian period's remarkable suicide and alcoholism statistics, in the extraordinarily high rates of what contemporary physicians described as nervous exhaustion among professional men, and in the private correspondence of men who found, sometimes in letters they never sent, or in diaries they never intended others to read, words for the loneliness of a model of marriage that required them to be less than fully human. The sexual constraints on men within Victorian marriage were also, in their specific Victorian form, distorting and damaging, though in ways entirely different from the constraints on women. Victorian marriage was built on the ideology of female sexual purity and passivity that we have already examined. But this ideology had a shadow side that the polite literature of the period only addresses obliquely. If the ideal Victorian wife was sexually passive and relatively uninterested in physical intimacy, where was the Victorian husband supposed to direct the sexual energy that the marriage did not fully accommodate? The answer, uncomfortable, hypocritical, and extensively documented, was the Victorian sex industry. London's prostitution economy in the mid-Victorian period was, by any measure, enormous. Henry Mayhew's 1861 survey of London street life estimated the number of prostitutes in London at between 55,000 and 80,000, though modern historians consider these figures likely inflated. The Lancet, in 1857, estimated the number more conservatively at around 8,000 registered prostitutes in London alone. Or whatever the precise numbers, and the disagreement about them is itself revealing, because the Victorian authorities had complicated reasons to both exaggerate and minimize the extent of the phenomenon. The sex industry of Victorian England was a major social institution that existed in explicit relationship to the Victorian marriage system. The domestic wife and the prostitute were not separate social phenomena. They were complementary elements of a single social arrangement, one providing respectability and legitimate reproduction, the other providing the sexual services that the ideology of wifely purity made unavailable within the marriage. The class dimensions of Victorian male sexual behavior complicate this picture further. Working-class men had somewhat different sexual cultures within marriage than middle-class men, partly because the rigid ideology of female passivity was less universally enforced in working-class households, and partly because the financial and social penalties for sexual directness were lower. But working-class men also had access to working-class women outside marriage through the same networks of domestic service, factory employment, and urban crowding that created constant opportunities for sexual contact across class lines. The Victorian middle-class man's use of domestic servants for sexual purposes is one of the period's most thoroughly documented and least discussed social phenomena. The power differential between a live-in servant and the household's male residents was absolute. The servant could not refuse without risk of dismissal and loss of her position, her housing, and her character reference. which was effectively her professional passport. The diaries and autobiographies of the period contain numerous references to these arrangements, always from the perspective of the men, almost never from the perspective of the women, who are largely absent from the archive of this history. The barrister William Harcourt, writing in the 1850s, noted with some detachment that the sexual exploitation of domestic servants was so common as to be effectively normalized in upper-middle-class households. He was not criticizing it. He was simply observing its prevalence. The observation itself is the historical evidence. The most honest assessment of Victorian marriage's effect on men is this: it served the interests of some men, particularly the propertied and the emotionally adaptable, reasonably well. It served the interests of a great many other men badly, crushing them financially, isolating them emotionally, and producing in them the specific Victorian male pathology of performing competence and strength while feeling inadequate and trapped. The men who wrote honestly about this, Robert Louis Stevenson, in his essay On Marriage, expresses the ambivalence with his characteristic precision. Marriage was a step so grave and decisive that it attracts light-headed, variable men by its very awfulness. The gravity of the commitment was part of its appeal, but it was also what made it so frequently a mistake that could not be undone. The specific emotional experience of fatherhood within Victorian marriage is another dimension of the institution that the Romantic mythology distorts, though in the opposite direction from the distortions applied to mothers. The Victorian father is typically presented as a remote authoritarian figure, the paterfamilias who presided over the household from a distance, who was respected rather than loved, who left the emotional work of parenting to the mother. This image contains some truth. The Victorian ideology of masculinity did emphasize authority, reserve, and professional detachment in ways that made overt emotional expressiveness in fathers culturally marginal. But the private record, the letters and diaries that Victorian men wrote, shows a considerably more complex picture of fathers who were deeply attached to their children, who worried about them, who were devastated by their deaths, and child deaths were common enough to be a persistent feature of Victorian family life, and who experienced the emotional rewards and costs of fatherhood in ways that the public performance of stoic masculinity was designed to conceal. The gap between the private emotional reality of Victorian fatherhood and its public ideological presentation is itself a form of suffering. The father who could not express his grief for a dead child in public because grief was unmanning, who could not acknowledge his attachment to a living one because affection was softness, who performed authority and reserve because those were the behaviors that Victorian masculine culture required and rewarded, while the actual experience of his children's lives was more vivid and more painful than the performance permitted. The Victorian period's management of male homosexuality within the institution of marriage is a subject that has been extensively studied since the 1980s and that deserves acknowledgement here because it reveals, with painful specificity, the coercive power of the marriage institution over men as well as women. The Victorian legal framework, specifically the Criminal Law Amendment Act of 1885, whose Labouchere Amendment criminalized gross indecency between men in private as well as in public, created a legal environment in which homosexual men faced a stark choice: maintain a cover of respectability through marriage or face prosecution, imprisonment, and social destruction. The number of Victorian men who married specifically to conceal their homosexuality cannot be precisely calculated, but it was substantial enough to be recognized as a social reality by those who moved in the relevant social circles. The consequences for their wives, women who married in good faith and found themselves in marriages that were hollow in ways they could not acknowledge publicly and could not legally escape, are largely undocumented because the wives' experiences were subordinated to the legal drama that centered on the men. Oscar Wilde's wife, Constance, is the most famous example. A woman who married in evident good faith, who bore 2 children, who managed the household and the family's social life with evident competence and devotion, and who was then destroyed financially, socially, physically, by the criminal prosecution of her husband, from which she had no more legal protection than a Victorian wife typically had from any catastrophe that her husband brought upon the household. Victorian middle-class marriage was not a household of 2. It was an institution that required a staff. The invisibility of domestic servants in most romantic accounts of Victorian marriage is one of the great distortions of the popular historical record. The cozy Victorian parlor with the fire crackling and the husband reading the newspaper and the wife doing needlework existed only because someone had laid and lit the fire, cleaned the grate, dusted the furniture, carried the coal, polished the silverware, cooked the meals, washed the dishes, made the beds, laundered the linen, and performed the 1,000 other acts of physical labor that kept the household functioning. That someone was almost always a woman, and she was almost always invisible, architecturally designed out of the main living spaces by the back stairs and servants' corridors that Victorian house design specifically incorporated, socially designed out of the Victorian imagination by a complex code of behaviors that governed how servants were spoken to, addressed, and thought about. The scale of domestic service in Victorian England is difficult to comprehend from a modern perspective. The 1881 census, the most detailed Victorian survey of occupations, recorded approximately 1.3 million domestic servants in England and Wales. This made domestic service the single largest employment category in the country, larger than agriculture or any industrial sector. The overwhelming majority of these servants were women, who predominantly between the ages of 15 and 30, typically from working-class families living in the households of their employers. In-service, as live-in domestic work was called, was one of the few respectable forms of employment available to working-class young women. It offered room, board, a small wage, and the character reference that was essential for future employment. It also offered extremely limited freedom, extremely long working hours, extremely close supervision by the household's mistress, and extremely restricted personal life. Servants in Victorian households typically worked 12 to 16 hours a day, 6.5 days a week, with Sunday afternoon and 1 additional half day per week as their only free time. They lived in the employer's household, which meant they were subject to the household's rules at all times, including rules about receiving followers, male visitors, about their behavior on their half-day off, about their appearance and demeanor within the house, and about the maintenance of the professional distance that Victorian employer-servant relations required. The Victorian middle-class wife's relationship with her servants was one of the defining challenges of Victorian domestic life, and the advice literature addressed it with extraordinary detail and remarkable condescension. Mrs. Isabella Beeton's Book of Household Management, published in 1861 and one of the best-selling books of the Victorian era, is often treated as a cookbook. It is far more than that. It is a comprehensive manual for the management of a Victorian domestic establishment, addressing everything from the proper preparation of roast beef to the correct method of engaging and dismissing domestic staff, the appropriate relationship between mistress and servants, and the specific duties of every category of household worker, from the housekeeper to the scullery maid. Beeton's advice about servants is remarkable for what it reveals about the power dynamics it is trying to manage. The ideal Victorian mistress, Beeton argued, should maintain a careful combination of authority and consideration. Firm in her demands, consistent in her standards, but not unkind, not capricious, and not so cold as to demoralize the staff. This prescription for managerial excellence assumes, throughout, that the mistress's authority is absolute and unquestioned. The servant's compliance is the baseline from which the discussion begins. The servant problem, as Victorians themselves called the difficulty of managing domestic staff, was a constant preoccupation of the Victorian middle class, and it reveals something important about the real nature of Victorian marriage. The Victorian wife was not, as the myth would have it, a passive ornament of the domestic sphere. She was its active manager, responsible for everything that happened in the household, from the quality of the food to the behavior of the children, to the appearance of the rooms, to the management of the household budget, to the supervision of a staff of workers who might range from a single overworked maid-of-all-work in a modest household to a complex establishment of a dozen or more specialized servants in a wealthy one. This was real work. It required skill, judgment, organizational ability, and an enormous expenditure of mental and emotional energy. The Victorian wife who managed a household well was performing a sophisticated managerial function, one that was not paid, not publicly recognized, and not legally protected, but that was genuinely demanding and genuinely consequential. The irony, which Victorian feminists noted explicitly, was that the management skills that a capable Victorian wife exercised in her household were precisely the skills that the professional world refused to employ. The woman who managed 12 servants and a complex domestic budget with skill and efficiency was told, by the culture that trapped her, that she was unfit for the professional or commercial world. The sexual politics of the servant relationship also shaped Victorian marriage in ways that the respectable surface of Victorian life carefully concealed. We have already noted the sexual exploitation of female servants by male household members, but the relationship between the Victorian wife and the female servants she supervised had its own specific tensions. The Victorian wife's authority over her servants was total within the household. But it was also fragile in ways that the formal hierarchy concealed. The servant who was seduced or assaulted by the household's male employer was typically dismissed, not the employer. The moral contamination, in Victorian logic, attached to the woman rather than the man. The wife who discovered that her husband had been sexually involved with a servant faced an impossible situation. She could not acknowledge it publicly without humiliating herself. She could not address it directly with her husband without threatening the marriage. She could dismiss the servant, which removed the symptom, but not the cause. Or she could simply pretend not to know. The pretending not to know option was, for many Victorian wives, the only practically available choice. To acknowledge what was happening was to acknowledge the fragility of her own position, the inadequacy of the legal protections available to her, and the disparity between the public ideology of Victorian marriage and its private reality. The working-class servant's experience of Victorian marriage, as observer, participant, and victim, is one of the most poorly documented aspects of the institution because the servants themselves left the least extensive written record. We know about their working conditions from census data, from the advice literature directed at their employers, from the proceedings of courts that occasionally adjudicated disputes between servants and employers, and from the rare cases in which servants themselves wrote accounts of their lives. What emerges from these sources is a picture of women who were intimately familiar with the realities of middle-class marriage, who cleaned up after it, who served the dinners at which its tensions played out, who witnessed the arguments and the silences and the separate bedrooms and the tears, and who were simultaneously almost completely powerless within the social and economic system that marriage represented. The servant who aspired to marriage herself, as most did, it being the only route out of service to an independent domestic life, was entering a system in which her own position would be only marginally better than the position of dependency and legal non-personhood that she had observed from below stairs. The physical environment of the Victorian middle-class household, the architecture, the decoration, the spatial organization of domestic life, was both a product and a reinforcement of the ideology of Victorian marriage. The mid-Victorian house was specifically designed to express and reproduce the social relations it contained: the formal reception rooms on the ground floor, where social performance and the maintenance of reputation occurred; the domestic service areas, carefully separated from the family spaces by back stairs and corridors; the private family rooms above, arranged in a hierarchy from the master bedroom at the top to the nursery and children's rooms further from the parental center; the physical separation of domestic labor from domestic life, the invisibility of the kitchen from the drawing room, the invisibility of the servant from the guest, was an architectural expression of the same ideology that made the labor of wives invisible and uncompensated. The middle-class Victorian home was a machine for the reproduction of social ideology, and its specific spatial arrangements encoded and enforced the class and gender hierarchies that Victorian marriage assumed. The Victorian household budget, the management of money in a middle-class household, was another site of the specific tensions that Victorian marriage produced. The convention that the husband controlled the household finances, providing his wife with a housekeeping allowance, from which she was expected to manage all domestic expenses, created a specific form of economic dependency within the marriage that was distinct from the broader legal dependency of the coverture system. The wife who was given an inadequate allowance had no legal mechanism for securing more. The wife who was given no allowance at all, whose husband simply paid the household bills directly, denying her any financial agency, was not uncommon. The wife who managed the household allowance with skill and managed to save small amounts from it, what was called pin money, was technically saving her husband's money, not her own, because her earnings from managing the household budget were his under the law. The domestic economy of the Victorian household was a microcosm of the broader economic inequality of Victorian marriage, reproducing the same asymmetries at the scale of weekly grocery purchases. The Victorians were not, despite their reputation, sexually repressed. They were sexually hypocritical, which is a completely different thing, and in some respects more sophisticated and more damaging. Sexual repression, and in its pure form, would mean the suppression of sexuality, the actual diminishment of sexual desire and activity through social and psychological mechanisms. This is probably not possible, and the Victorians did not achieve it even in the attempts they made. What they achieved instead was a comprehensive public performance of sexual innocence combined with an equally comprehensive private continuation of sexual life. With the public performance required of everyone and the private reality permitted to some people under carefully managed conditions of concealment. The key word is some. The double standard, the Victorian principle that sexual behavior that was acceptable in men was unacceptable in women, was not an incidental inconsistency in Victorian sexual culture. It was its organizing principle, and it shaped every aspect of Victorian marriage, from its formation to its daily operation to its dissolution. The sexual double standard operated at multiple levels simultaneously. At the level of personal reputation, a Victorian man's sexual history was largely irrelevant to his marriage prospects, provided it had been conducted with appropriate discretion. A Victorian woman's sexual history was her most important attribute, not her intelligence, not her character, not her abilities, but the absence of any sexual history whatsoever. A woman who had been sexually active before marriage was, regardless of the circumstances, effectively unmarriageable in respectable society. At the level of marital behavior, A Victorian husband's adultery was a moral failing and a personal betrayal, but it was not legally actionable. As we have noted, a wife could not divorce on grounds of adultery alone. A Victorian wife's adultery was, by contrast, a legal and social catastrophe of the first order. Grounds for divorce, grounds for the permanent loss of custody of her children, and grounds for her complete social exclusion from respectable life. At the level of criminal law, the Contagious Diseases Acts of 1864, 1866, and 1869, legislation designed to reduce the spread of venereal disease in garrison towns and naval ports, mandated the forcible medical examination and detention of women suspected of being prostitutes. There was no equivalent provision for the men who used their services. The acts explicitly constructed the problem as one of female sexuality rather than male, the women who spread disease rather than the men who created the demand. The Contagious Diseases Acts produced one of the most important protest movements of the Victorian period, the Ladies' National Association for the Repeal of the Contagious Diseases Acts, organized by Josephine Butler and launched in 1869. Butler's campaign against the acts is remarkable for several reasons. First, it was led by women at a time when women's public political activity was considered inappropriate by most of polite society. Second, it required Butler and her colleagues to discuss, in public and in explicit terms, the subjects of venereal disease, prostitution, and the sexual exploitation of women, topics that Victorian conventions said no respectable woman should address directly. Third, it identified, with moral precision and intellectual force, the systemic injustice of a legal framework that punished women for the consequences of a demand that men created. Butler's most famous phrase from the campaign, "The woman always bears the brunt," captures the fundamental logic of the Victorian double standard. Whatever went wrong in the sexual economy of Victorian society, disease, poverty, illegitimate children, social disruption, the woman paid the price. The man moved on. The vast Victorian literature of sexual scandal, the trial reports in the newspapers, the breach of promise cases, the divorce court proceedings, the criminal trials for seduction and rape, makes the operation of the double standard visible with a specificity that the polite literature of the period conceals. Breach of promise was a legal action available to a woman whose suitor had promised marriage and then withdrawn the promise, which, given the social and financial consequences of a failed engagement to a Victorian woman, was genuinely damaging. Breach of promise cases were common and extensively reported, and they reveal a social system in which the promise of marriage was routinely used as a means of obtaining sexual favors from women who would not otherwise have consented to them, and in which the man's subsequent withdrawal of the promise left the woman with no recourse except the public exposure and partial financial compensation of a lawsuit. The pattern was consistent. Man makes promises. Woman, trusting the promises, enters a sexual relationship. Man withdraws. Woman is ruined. Woman sues. The sympathies of the Victorian press were sometimes with the woman and sometimes with the man, depending on the class and social position of the parties. But the underlying structure of the situation repeated itself with the consistency of a social mechanism, not a series of individual unfortunate events. The specific suffering of women whose reputations had been damaged by sexual scandal, whether through genuine sexual activity, or through mere association, or through the misfortune of being raped or assaulted by someone whose accusation could not be publicly challenged, was codified in the Victorian period as a specific social category, the fallen woman. The fallen woman was one of the most powerful and most morally loaded figures in Victorian culture. She appeared in paintings. The pre-Raphaelites were particularly fascinated by her in ways that are revealing of the complex male attitudes she embodied. In novels, in theatrical melodramas, in charitable campaigns, and in the moral instruction literature that was one of the Victorian period's most prolific genres. What is striking about the Victorian treatment of the fallen woman across all these genres is the consistency with which she is treated as an object of pity, of moral instruction, of aesthetic contemplation, rather than as a subject. Her perspective on how she came to be in her situation, her assessment of the men who put her there, her own desires and intentions and experiences are almost universally absent from the cultural record. She is always viewed from outside, never from inside. The charitable institutions for fallen women, the Magdalen homes and penitentiaries that the Victorian philanthropic establishment maintained, provide a partial exception because they sometimes required the women they housed to give verbal accounts of their histories, and some of those accounts have survived. They make painful reading. Young women seduced by employers, or by men who promised marriage, or by men who used force, or by the simple arithmetic of poverty and opportunity, and then consigned to institutions that required them to perform domestic labor and religious penance in exchange for the minimal shelter and food that kept them alive. The Victorian marriage system was in this sense a machine for producing fallen women. It created an economy in which women's economic survival depended on marriage, and in which marriage required sexual virtue as a prerequisite, in which sexual virtue was defined entirely in terms of the absence of any sexual history, and in which men's sexual activity created the constant pressure to compromise the sexual virtue that women's survival required. The poor woman who was seduced by her employer, or who accepted sexual advances from a man whose economic assistance she needed, or who was assaulted and then faced the impossible choice of silence or public exposure, she was not a moral failure. She was a rational actor in a fundamentally irrational system, making the choices that the system had designed her circumstances to force. The Victorian philanthropists who operated the Magdalen homes did not understand this, or rather, some of them did understand it. And those who did were among the most important social reformers of the period. The Josephine Butlers and the Florence Nightingales and the Octavia Hills, who saw the systematic nature of women's vulnerability and argued for structural change rather than individual moral rehabilitation. The specific legal position of the illegitimate child, the child born to an unmarried woman, is one of the most illuminating points of contact between Victorian sexual hypocrisy and Victorian marriage ideology. The illegitimate child, in Victorian law called a bastard, without any of the modern squeamishness about the term, had no legal claim on its father, no right to its father's name, no right to inheritance, and no legal relationship with any family except its mother. It was, legally, the mother's child, alone. And this meant that the man whose sexual activity had produced the child bore no legal obligation to support it unless the mother took the specific legal step of establishing paternity through the courts, a process that required identifying the father, serving legal process on him, proving the paternity claim against a defendant who would almost certainly deny it, and surviving the social exposure of the entire proceeding. Very few women attempted this. Fewer succeeded. The illegitimate child and its mother were, therefore, entirely dependent on whatever private provision the father chose to make, on the charity of their own families, or on the poor law system. Many Victorian women chose between abandoning their illegitimate children, in which case those children often died, either directly or in the inadequate care of baby farmers, and the workhouse. Neither option was anything other than a further punishment for the woman for the sexual activity of both parties. The Victorian period's relationship with pornography, which flourished as an underground industry throughout the period, despite, or perhaps because of, the relentless official insistence on public sexual purity, is one of the more revealing contradictions of Victorian sexual culture. The Obscene Publications Act of 1857, passed by the same Parliament that was reforming the divorce law, was one of the first pieces of modern censorship legislation, and its passage reflects the specific Victorian anxiety about the relationship between sexual knowledge and social order. The Act gave magistrates the power to seize and destroy obscene publications. Its practical effect was to drive the underground market for sexually explicit materials further underground while doing very little to reduce the overall supply or demand. Victorian pornography, which exists in substantial quantities in archives and which has been studied by scholars of Victorian sexuality, is revealing in its specific content. It frequently addresses the specific sexual tensions and fantasies produced by the Victorian marriage system rather than simply providing generic sexual stimulation. The figure of the sexually available wife, the willing maid, the forbidden encounter across class lines. These are the specific fantasies of a sexual culture shaped by a marriage institution that desexualized the respectable woman while making every sexual contact outside that institution legally and socially hazardous. The Victorian birth control movement, which existed, though the mainstream culture was deeply hostile to it, represents another dimension of the underground resistance to Victorian marriage ideology. Annie Besant and Charles Bradlaugh's 1877 prosecution for publishing Charles Knowlton's birth control pamphlet, The Fruits of Philosophy, was one of the most watched legal cases of the decade. The prosecution failed, and the publicity it generated, the trial was reported across the country, dramatically increased public knowledge of birth control methods. The aftermath of the trial showed a measurable decline in the Victorian birth rate, which suggests that the information, once available, was widely acted upon. What is significant about this from the perspective of Victorian marriage is what the birth control movement represented. The claim that women had the right to control their own reproduction, to decide how many children they would bear and when, and to exercise that control through deliberate choice rather than through the hope and prayer that characterized Victorian approaches to family planning in respectable households. This was a radical claim in the context of the Victorian marriage system, which had no legal mechanism for recognizing women's reproductive autonomy at all. Victorian marriage did not simply persist unchanged from 1837 to 1901. It was under constant pressure throughout the period. And by the end of Victoria's reign, it was a substantially different institution from what it had been at the beginning, changed by legislation, by economic transformation, by the organized activism of women, and by the shifting cultural attitudes that the reformers' arguments had produced. The story of those changes is partly a story of legal reform, but it is more fundamentally a story of what happens when the gap between the official ideology of an institution and the actual experience of that institution becomes too large to sustain, when the people trapped within it become too numerous and too organized to be ignored, and when the intellectual arguments for change become too well made and too publicly available to be dismissed. The legal changes began, slowly and incompletely, in the 1850s. The Matrimonial Causes Act of 1857, which we have already examined, created the secular divorce court and made divorce theoretically accessible to more people. The Married Women's Property Acts of 1870 and 1882 gave married women the right to keep their own earnings and to own property. The Guardianship of Infants Act of 1886 gave mothers the right to apply for custody and guardianship of their children after their husband's death, a right they had not previously possessed. The Criminal Law Amendment Act of 1885 raised the age of sexual consent from 13 to 16, an explicit acknowledgement that the existing law had been allowing the systematic sexual exploitation of working-class girls. Each of these reforms was bitterly contested, Each was preceded by years or decades of campaigning, petition, and public debate. Each was presented by its opponents as a threat to the social order. Each passed Parliament only when the combination of public pressure, political necessity, and accumulated evidence of injustice became impossible to resist. The expansion of women's education was perhaps the most transformative single development in the remaking of Victorian marriage. Girton College, Cambridge, was founded in 1869. Newnham College followed in 1871. The London School of Medicine for Women opened in 1874. Women's access to secondary education expanded dramatically in the 1870s and 1880s, driven both by legislative reform and by the establishment of girls' schools by organizations like the Girls' Public Day School Trust, founded in 1872. The educated woman was a different kind of marriage market participant than her uneducated predecessor. She had credentials, professional possibilities, and intellectual resources that created, for the first time, a genuine alternative to marriage as a means of economic survival. She also had a language for her situation, a theoretical framework developed in the increasing academic and literary culture of the women's education movement that allowed her to identify and articulate the specific injustices of the Victorian marriage system in ways that the earlier generation of reformers had had to construct from scratch. The expansion of women's education also changed the specific character of Victorian marriage itself. An educated woman was a different kind of partner than an uneducated one, and some Victorian men valued this difference, sought it out, and built marriages that were more genuinely collaborative and intellectually equal than the Victorian ideal prescribed. Not many at first, but the number grew. The economic transformation of the late Victorian period also reshaped the marriage institution in ways that the legal reforms alone could not have accomplished. The expansion of the Victorian economy created new employment opportunities, particularly in the clerical and retail sectors, that began, tentatively, to open to women from the 1870s and 1880s onward. The telegraph, the typewriter, and the expansion of the postal and retail systems created categories of respectable employment that had not previously existed. By the 1890s, the female typist, the female shop assistant, and the female telegraph operator were recognizable social figures, imperfectly paid, unsubject to dismissal upon marriage in most cases, but genuinely employed in ways that provided at least the possibility of independent subsistence. The effect of these new employment opportunities on the marriage market was complex. On one hand, they provided women with alternatives to marriage that reduced the coercive economic pressure on them to accept unsuitable partners. On the other hand, the wages of women in these new occupations were still set deliberately below the male wage for equivalent work, on the explicit principle that women would eventually marry and did not need a full living wage, which meant that the economic independence on offer was always partial and precarious. The cultural shift in attitudes toward marriage in the late Victorian period is visible in the literature of the period in ways that the earlier Victorian literature does not prepare you for. Thomas Hardy's novels, particularly Jude the Obscure, published in 1895, and The Woodlanders, present Victorian marriage not as a romantic institution, but as a trap, a legal mechanism that bound incompatible people together in mutual misery, and that the social and religious authorities maintained against all rational evidence of its harmfulness. Hardy's treatment of marriage was so uncompromising that the critical reception of Jude the Obscure was largely hostile, with reviewers condemning it as immoral and one bishop reportedly burning his copy. Hardy never wrote another novel. George Bernard Shaw's plays, Mrs. Warren's Profession, Moll, written in 1893, though not publicly performed until 1902, and You Never Can Tell in Candida, systematically dismantled the Victorian romantic ideology of marriage and placed it in the economic and social context that the ideology was designed to conceal. Mrs. Warren's profession, which presented prostitution as a rational economic choice for women, offered the alternative of starvation or marriage to an abusive man, was banned by the Lord Chamberlain for years as indecent. The fact that it was considered indecent reveals something important about the Victorian period. It was not the sexual content that disturbed the censors so much as the economic argument, which was too accurate to be comfortable. The new woman, the cultural figure who emerged in the 1880s and 1890s as the embodiment of the changing possibilities for women's lives, represents the most concentrated form of the late Victorian challenge to the marriage ideal. The new woman was a media construction, partly, but she was a media construction based on real women, women who attended university, who worked in professional fields, who cycled, the bicycle being a specific symbol of female freedom and mobility in the 1890s, who were unmarried by choice rather than by failure, who had opinions and expressed them, and who refused to accept the terms of Victorian marriage as the only available definition of a worthy female life. The new woman provoked extraordinary anxiety in the Victorian establishment, an anxiety that was all out of proportion to the actual numbers of women who fit the description. She was caricatured in the press as mannish, graceless, and unfeminine. She was portrayed in a widely read genre of anti-feminist novels as selfish, sexually dubious, and ultimately self-destructive. She was lectured by physicians who claimed, on the basis of the period's specific mixture of genuine medical concern and ideological motivated reasoning, that too much education was physically dangerous to women. The anxiety was not really about the new woman's cycling or her typewriting or even her political opinions. The anxiety was about what her existence implied, that Victorian marriage was not the natural destination of all women, that women could choose otherwise, and that the enormous social apparatus that had been constructed to ensure that they had no choice might be dismantled. The social purity movements of the 1880s and 1890s also contributed, in more ambiguous ways, to the transformation of Victorian marriage attitudes. Movements like the White Cross Army, a male purity movement founded in 1883 that asked men to pledge chastity and respect for women, represented an attempt to reform the sexual double standard from within the existing social framework rather than by dismantling it. The social purity movements were problematic in various ways. They frequently scapegoated working-class women, prostitutes, and immigrants, while focusing their reform energies on the sexual behavior of middle-class men. They were often allied with deeply conservative forces in Victorian society, and they sometimes made the situation of the women they claimed to protect worse by providing rhetorical cover for moral panics that resulted in increased surveillance and restriction of women's movement and behavior. But they also represented something genuine, the acknowledgement, by a significant number of Victorian men, that the sexual double standard was morally wrong, that the exploitation of women in the sex trade was a social failure for which men bore substantial responsibility, and that the ideology of marriage that had been constructed on the premise of female purity required rethinking. By the end of Victoria's reign in 1901, Victorian marriage was recognizably in transition. The legal framework had been reformed in ways that gave married women a degree of legal personhood that their grandmothers had entirely lacked. Women's education had expanded dramatically. The employment possibilities for middle-class women had grown, however, inadequately. The cultural conversation about marriage had been transformed by 60 years of increasingly explicit feminist argument. The divorce rate was still low by modern standards, but it had increased substantially, from the essentially zero rate of the pre-1857 period. The institution was not remade. The wage gap persisted. The social expectation that women would marry and leave employment persisted. The custody presumptions had been adjusted but not equalized. The political exclusion of women, the denial of the vote, persisted until 1918 for women over 30 and until 1928 for all women. But the direction of change was established. The intellectual arguments had been made. The legal precedents had been set. The organized movement that would eventually dismantle the Victorian marriage institution had been built. And the women who had built it, the Josephine Butlers, the Caroline Nortons, the Barbara Lee Smith Bottishons, the Millicent Fawcett's, the Elizabeth Garrett Andersons, had demonstrated with their own lives and with their extraordinary political and intellectual productivity that the ideological foundations of Victorian marriage were not natural, not inevitable, and not permanent. The relationship between Victorian marriage and the specific cultural phenomenon of the Victorian novel is too important to leave in a brief reference. The novel was the dominant literary form of the Victorian period, and the marriage plot, the story of a woman's journey from independence to the altar, was its dominant narrative structure. The marriage plot appears everywhere in Victorian fiction, from the most conservative to the most radical, and its ubiquity is itself a historical fact of the first importance. Victorian culture was so organized around the question of who married whom, and under what conditions, and with what consequences, that its most popular literary form was structured around that question as its primary organizing principle. But the marriage plot was not monolithic. Victorian novelists used it in radically different ways, from the conservative reassurance that virtuous women were rewarded with good marriages, to the radical critique that the entire institution was a trap. Between these poles were the enormous majority of Victorian novels about marriage, which occupied the complicated middle ground, acknowledging the real difficulties and injustices of the institution while unable or unwilling to propose alternatives, finding in the individual virtuous character and the exceptional partnership a private solution to a public problem. The specific economic crisis of the late Victorian period, the long depression of the 1870s and 1880s, reshaped Victorian marriage in ways that have been underemphasized in standard accounts. The long depression, which hit British industry and agriculture with particular force from the 1870s onward, reduced the incomes of the middle class and upper working class men whose financial soundness was the prerequisite for respectable marriage. Men who had expected to be comfortably established in their professions by their late 20s found themselves unable to afford the household establishment that marriage required. Marriage ages rose among men. The number of men who remained permanently unmarried rose. The surplus of unmarried women, redundant women, in the brutal phrase of the Victorian demographers, increased. The economic crisis made visible what had always been true but conveniently obscured. The Victorian marriage system was a financial transaction, and when the financial conditions that the transaction required were not met, the transaction did not occur, and the women who had organized their lives around the expectation of it were left stranded. The mythology of Victorian marriage, the white dress, the blushing bride, the domestic idol, was not an innocent mistake. It was a function of power, the power of the people who benefited from the Victorian marriage system to control the story told about it, both during the Victorian period itself and afterward. The story they told required the suppression of enormous amounts of evidence. It required ignoring the testimony of millions of women who had lived within the institution and documented its reality in letters, diaries, novels, pamphlets, and court proceedings. It required treating the anger, frustration, and organized political activism of Victorian women as an anomaly, the complaints of exceptional individuals, rather than as the systemic response to a systemic injustice. The specific material legacies of Victorian marriage are still visible in ways that most people don't recognize as Victorian. The white wedding dress, ubiquitous, expected, laden with symbolic weight, is Victorian, specifically derived from Victoria's own 1840 choice and solidified into convention by the mid-19th century. Its association with virginity and purity is Victorian. The entire commercial apparatus of the modern wedding industry, the dress, the flowers, the cake, the reception, is essentially a Victorian innovation, scaled up, commodified, and exported globally by the culture that grew from Victorian Britain. The expectation that a woman will change her surname upon marriage is not universal, not ancient, and not inevitable. But it feels natural because it has been the default convention in English-speaking cultures since the Victorian period, when the legal doctrine of coverture made the surrender of her name the most visible symbol of the surrender of her legal identity. The assumption that a woman's primary identity is her domestic and familial role, wife, mother, manager of the household, is a Victorian ideological construction, intensified and systematized during the Victorian period in ways that had not characterized earlier European history. Medieval and early modern European women worked alongside men, conducted trades and businesses, and were not universally confined to the domestic sphere. The specifically Victorian ideology of the angel in the house, the phrase is Coventry Patmore's, from his 1854 poem of that name, describing the ideal wife as a creature of selfless domestic devotion, was a mid-19th century invention, not an eternal truth about female nature. The legal legacy of Victorian marriage is also more present than most people realize. Marital rape was legal in England until 1991. The presumption of paternal custody was not equalized until the late 20th century. The wage gap between men and women, which the Victorian period embedded in law and custom, and which was explicitly designed to keep women economically dependent on marriage, has not been eliminated even in 2026, despite more than a century of legal reform and political activism. The psychological legacy is harder to measure but arguably equally significant. The Victorian prescription for female behavior, be accommodating, be cheerful, minimize your own needs, subordinate your desires to those of your husband and children, never appear too ambitious or too clever, does not simply evaporate because the legal framework that enforced it has been dismantled. Cultural expectations are more persistent than laws. The women who were raised within Victorian norms transmitted those norms to their daughters, who transmitted them to theirs, in an attenuating chain that is still not fully played out. But the deepest legacy of Victorian marriage, and here I want to be careful about the claim I am making, may be the model of aspiration that it provided for those who came after. The Victorian reformers who fought against the specific injustices of the Victorian marriage system were not, for the most part, fighting against the institution of marriage itself. They were fighting for the legal conditions under which marriage could be something other than a property transaction, in which it could be, if not the romantic ideal of Victorian ideology, then at least a genuine partnership between people with equal legal standing and genuine freedom of choice. That aspiration, the aspiration to a marriage of equals, founded on genuine choice and sustained by genuine mutual respect, is the positive inheritance of the Victorian reform movements. It is what Josephine Butler was fighting for when she campaigned against the Contagious Diseases Acts. It is what Caroline Norton was fighting for when she petitioned Parliament for custody of her children. It is what John Stuart Mill was arguing for when he wrote The Subjection of Women. We have not fully achieved it. The gap between the ideal and the reality of marriage in 2026 is smaller than the gap that existed in 1860, but it has not been closed. The economic inequality between men and women that makes marriage a different choice for women than for men, because the consequences of leaving, the consequences of the career interruption of childbearing, the consequences of the division of domestic labor, are still not symmetrical. The cultural expectations about what women owe to marriage and what marriage owes to women are still not equal. Understanding Victorian marriage, really understanding it, but beyond the white dress and the domestic idyll, is not merely a historical exercise, it is a way of seeing the foundations beneath the present. The world we live in is built, in significant part, on Victorian structures, Victorian assumptions, and Victorian myths. Many of those structures have been reformed. Many of those assumptions have been challenged. Some of the myths have been dismantled. But the work is not finished, and it cannot be finished if we do not understand clearly where it began. Thank you for watching Boring History Lovers, where we take the romance out of history to find what was actually there. Sources for everything in this video are in the description below. If you found this useful, subscribe. We do this for every era, every civilization, every myth that deserves a harder look.